It is January 19th, 2025, and not only are Hamas and Israel entering into a deal that includes a 6-week ceasefire and the exchange of hostages, but we are also one day away from Donald Trump returning to the White House. So, what is Trump's return going to mean for really the entire world at this point, right? We look at the Middle East. We look at the fact that for the next 6 weeks at least, Israel is expected to not drop any bombs on the Gaza Strip. So, what is that preparing them for? Right? Are they looking at a much larger regional conflict? And could Trump be just kind of the latest useful tool in bringing that about? I'm, of course, talking about Iran and the situation now that you no longer have the Assad government in Syria. What does that mean for the potential for a war involving the US, Israel, and Iran? And then we also have the situation over in Ukraine, where Trump has campaigned so heavily on ending the war there. He has sworn that he would do it as soon as he got into office. Well, anyone paying attention knows it's not going to be quite that easy. And the signs that we're getting from at least Trump's cabinet so far have been that they're not exactly going to be looking at doing everything that they can to get a deal. In fact, it looks like they may be trying to put more pressure on Russia, thinking that they will then get to the negotiating table. And then at the end of the day, there's also the question of China, right? What does all of this mean for the potential for war with China? And is this all building up to that? We got into all of that and more with a special guest earlier. But before we get to that interview, just a quick note here. If you like conversations like this, if you want to support my work and you're also interested in seeing additional exclusive weekly content, you can find all of that on my page. Patreon. I'll leave the link in the description box below, but do be sure to check that out. And now let's get into today's interview. Joining me now to discuss is Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Thank you for having me on.
I'm glad I get to talk to you today about a few different things, but first I want to start out with this deal. It's between Israel and Hamas. They're entering into it on Sunday, and it could see a 6-week-long ceasefire and the release of dozens of hostages by Hamas, along with hundreds of prisoners by Israel. Now, I know that there are a lot of people celebrating, particularly on the Palestinian side, and then on Israel's side, you have members of their government threatening to resign over this deal. Will you take us through kind of how you see the deal and what it actually means for both Israel and Hamas?
Well, I think many people need to kind of zoom out and just take account of how this conflict has unfolded over the many years. The 2008 to 2009 Operation Cast Lead, the 2014 Operation Protective Edge, these were episodes of extreme violence by Israel against the Palestinian people, and Gaza in particular, laying waste to this tiny strip of land by the sea, killing thousands and thousands of people, international outcry, eroding Israel's international standing. But all of this connected to geopolitical events unfolding, especially elsewhere in the region. All of this violence is always used to try to refocus attention and energy in the region, especially among these groups of extremists the U.S. and its regional allies have cultivated there, and especially in 2014, Operation Protective Edge. This was meant to revigorate the legitimacy and cohesion of these groups, particularly in regards to nearby Syria. And we can see how this operation this time was actually used to precipitate a much wider regional conflict. Israel was not only bombing Gaza, tormenting the people there, they were also bombing Syria, Lebanon, even Yemen, and actually also Iran for the first time now. So all of this was part of precipitating a much wider conflict and using all of the blind emotions on both sides to focus people and direct them in a way that was favorable for the United States. And I would say that Israel and the Palestinian people are the losers in this conflict. The U.S. has achieved one of its major objectives, wiping out Syria, critically damaging Hezbollah, and further isolating Iran. So, with all of that in mind, this ceasefire is just another step in this endless cycle of violence. It is virtually meaningless, a temporary reprieve for the Palestinian people. The violence is almost certain to begin again, just a matter of time.
Yeah, and I know that that's something that Israel has brought up as they're trying to kind of contain their far right genocidal maniacs. They're going, it's okay, we can go back to killing Palestinians if we want to. We can go back to that after phase one and after we get some of the prisoners back. And it's interesting because when it comes to the conversation about Israel's history of supporting Hamas and using it as a tool in the Gaza Strip to prevent any kind of legitimate Palestinian leadership, that all kind of disappeared after the October 7th attacks. And the conversation shifted to the Palestinian resistance and support for them as a whole. And I think a lot of times that's because we want to see a resistance rising up for the oppressed people, right? How many movies had that being the storyline where it becomes something that the average person wants to support? But in this case, talking about Hamas and talking about how kind of the public's view of Hamas has shifted to them being more of a heroic resistance, how do you see that, and how has that played to the detriment of the Palestinian people who, I mean, now we don't even know the true death toll in Gaza of just the last 15 months of Israel's genocidal blockade and bombardment that they've carried out?
It's a really good question. People want to believe in a resistance for the Palestinian people. What Israel is doing is horrendous, and people want to see justice. They want to see someone protect the Palestinian people. Unfortunately, Hamas is not a legitimate resistance organization. It never was. It branched out of the Muslim Brotherhood, where Al-Qaeda and all the other extremist organizations, the US and before that the British Empire, used to shape the region. And as a matter of fact, just used to overrun Syria, something that Hamas applauded and publicly celebrated and congratulated them on wiping out the Syrian government, which had for decades supported the Palestinian people in all kinds of ways. So that is the real unfortunate part. A real legitimate resistance. We cannot just follow our hearts and support a group that superficially appears to be fighting Israel, its oppressive government, its horrendous policy towards the Palestinian people. We have to follow the money. We have to see where Hamas gets its money, its guns, its support, its ability to continue to exist in a tiny little strip surrounded on all sides by Israel. How does it do that? And if you dig through the money trail, you will see that it leads to Qatar, which is hosting one of the largest, if not the largest, U.S. airbase in the region, has been instrumental in the overthrow of the Syrian government. Before that, the Libyan government in 2011, and a continued U.S. posture toward ultimately circling, containing, dividing, and destroying Iran itself. So this is the reality of Hamas. People need to see that. They need to see that what the U.S. is doing in the region is creating a strategy of tension between extremists on both sides, the Israelis, the Muslim Brotherhood on the other side. And these are two proxies the U.S. ultimately controls, two proxies that do not invest in the best interests of the populations that they preside over, whether it's in Gaza or the internationally recognized borders of Israel.
Yeah, and I think it's hard to kind of come to grips with that at times, or especially when you look at the suffering of the Palestinians and you think, well, surely someone has to be standing up for them. It doesn't really feel like there are many people that are at the end of the day. But I want to go back to one thing you mentioned about Iran, because you have Iran in this position. Again, when you're talking about the resistance, you see Iran as kind of the chief player in that. The US, looking at the incoming Trump administration, according to them, everything goes back to Iran, right? Everything bad in the Middle East has to be Iran centric. Well, you have Iran in this position of praising the deal, the ceasefire deal, even calling it a victory for the Palestinian people. And your take on X really stood out to me because you wrote that, quote, the US achieved all of its goals using Hamas to trigger a regional war finally eliminating Syria and wiping out Hezbollah's senior leadership. And then you went on to note that when it comes to Iran, Iran is next. This is a necessary and temporary pause to prepare for the next stage of reshaping and reasserting control over the region. Now, given that, again, Trump is coming back to the White House on Monday, where do your concerns stand about how the U.S. could start to target Iran directly, and what could that look like? Are we talking about an all-out war here, or are we just talking about an escalation of what we've seen so far?
Well, I don't think that anything is set in stone. This is continuity of agenda. It really doesn't matter who is president. For incoming President Trump, yes, he's very aggressive and very open and focused on Iran, but the United States, the special interests that determine foreign policy, they are focused on Russia regarding Ukraine, Iran in the Middle East, of course, China in the Asia Pacific, and they will focus on all of these if and when necessary, when the circumstances allow it. But what we will see is the U.S. attempt to capitalize on this perceived moment of off balance for Iran. We have to understand that with Syria taken out of the equation, one of the first things the U.S. and Israel made sure of was all of its integrated air defense systems were eliminated. This is now free airspace for the U.S., Israel, and anyone else alongside the U.S. can now use to create a corridor to strike at Iran directly. And this is a huge problem because before that, this was airspace the US and Israel had to fly around. And if they wanted to strike targets in Syria itself, they had to conduct standoff strikes. So this is a huge moment where Iran really is isolated militarily, strategically, even diplomatically. They've lost a very close long-term ally in Syria. And now all of these extremists that spent years and years trying to overthrow the Syrian government, now they're free to go point their guns elsewhere, whether it's at Iran itself or other allies of Iran's in the regions. This is a huge problem. The U.S. is going to try to capitalize on this. This was set up during the Biden administration, and now the incoming Trump administration is positioned perfectly to exploit it to its fullest extent.
Yeah, it's interesting how that happens, isn't it? I love how the
Yes.
Democrats and Republicans here in the US, they love to act like they're on opposite sides of the aisle, right? Trump is literally Hitler. And then you look at the way it's just kind of perfectly set up. I mean, that's the exact same case. Well, not the exact same. It's a similar case to what we're seeing in Venezuela right now, where you see the Biden administration ramping up tensions, getting ready for the Trump administration to come in. Now, when it comes to the situation with Iran, I'm always curious too. We talk a lot about this growing multipolar world and how, Russia and China, they're growing so much stronger. They have various alliances that are growing stronger, and that one day that is going to be a major challenge to US hegemony. And when I look at things like the suffering of the Palestinians, I think sometimes I almost get frustrated with it because I'm going, okay, why is no one standing up and doing something, right? And why is no one standing up to Israel? If we're going to talk about having international law, then there needs to be some kind of legitimate mechanism for if it seems like one body of people is trying to wipe another body of people off the face of the earth, then something has to be done about it. When it comes to kind of where the multipolar world stands, especially if we do see the US ramping up targeting of Iran and looking like we're going to see a major escalation there, how do you see the position of China and Russia in that case? Are they likely to get more involved? Or are they likely to, as we've kind of seen in what we've seen so far, they handle their affairs at home and then they make help in various ways because, they have different allegiances with Iran, but it's not them directly getting involved and going to war?
I think it's a really good question. I think that if Russia, let's just say just Russia and China, I think if they could prevent the U.S. from overthrowing the Iranian government or targeting and isolating Iran, I think that they would. But the reality is they have limits to what they are capable of doing. Russia is engaged in a large-scale, protracted, intense conflict in Ukraine with the summation of NATO's military power in Europe. China is watching the United States amass its military forces all along its periphery in the Asia Pacific, and they have limited means to combat this. Just that alone, let alone project military power into the Middle East. We saw Russia attempt to do this in Syria, and we see how that ended. It ended with Syria collapsing. This should be a wake up call to us, everyone who is watching the rise of the multipolar world. This is a wake up call that there are limits, and these are indicators of those limits. Something like the genocide taking place of the Palestinian people, the fact that the multipolar world is not powerful enough to stop this, or even in a more convincing way oppose it, still at this juncture, this tells us there's still a very long way to go. The US and the collective West had tremendous power. There is huge momentum behind that, even if all the signs of irreversible decline are there. There's tremendous momentum, and we have to resist the temptation to underestimate what the US is still capable of, the carnage and devastation they are still very much capable of imposing.
Yeah, and I think that that's good to keep in mind. In a way, looking at Ukraine and looking at the way that the war has transpired over the last nearly 3 years now, that may have put a lot of people in a place where they're like, all right, the US is finally, we've got Russia rising, we've got China rising, things are going to change on the world stage. I think that's still a bit of a ways off, but I am curious about your take on the latest when it comes to the war in Ukraine, because you have Donald Trump in a position where he's repeatedly campaigned and he's going to come in and he's going to end this war. Now, we obviously know it's not going to be that easy. I mean, every report I've seen on what the incoming Trump administration may suggest or what they may present to Vladimir Putin in terms of a frozen conflict or a possible deal, that is all going to be a non-starter for Russia on day one, right? Something I would not expect them to consider. Now, given that Russian forces are steadily making gains in both the Donbass along the front lines, as well as in Kursk, where they have reported that they've taken back more than 60% of the territory that Kiev took when it launched its incursion back in August. How do you see the state of the war in Ukraine and kind of what Trump is going to be getting into when he officially takes office?
Well, as I have said many times over the last 3 years, it's a war of attrition, and Russia is deeply invested in this war of attrition to the point where there are cracks in the limits of Russian power elsewhere along their periphery. But as you said, this is a conflict Russia cannot compromise from their point of view, and I think objectively this is true. It is a matter of self-preservation. NATO has advanced up and along Russia's border, and the plan always was to eventually absorb Russia itself into a U.S. politically captured Europe. It's interesting that we were just talking about continuity of agenda. We should think back to Trump's first term in office, when he was campaigning, his perception of all of the wars when they were Obama's wars. And then when they became his wars, he was very happy to continue absolutely every single one of them, and even attempt to start new wars. People said, well, he didn't start any new wars, but he campaigned on a platform of ending all of the wars. He ended none of them. And he set the stage to start several more wars. And he's doing the exact same thing now. So I'm very confident that once he is president and once Ukraine is his proxy war, he will be happy to have it continue for as long as possible. The plan is to use Ukraine, as some US politicians have even openly said, to the last Ukrainian, to raise the cost as high as possible for Russia, to extend Russia. It really isn't to defend or save Ukraine. It is to stretch Russia out as far as possible, in combination with other conflicts elsewhere, including Syria. Imagine if Russia doubled down in Syria, how critical this situation could have become. So this is a huge conflict that I don't see any end in sight in the near or intermediate future, and I don't think incoming President Trump has any intention at all of ending it.
Yeah, it was interesting to me that he campaigned so hard on literally saying, I'm going to end this war as president-elect. I'm going to end it in 24 hours. And I'm sitting here going, okay, well, I mean, maybe if you go into a meeting and say, all right, President Putin, I'm giving you every single thing you want, but we all know that Trump would not be able to do that, that that's not something that the US establishment would allow. They would not allow the US to just drop Ukraine entirely after all they've done, after all of the hard work that the CIA has put in after more than a decade now. But when it comes to what's happening on the battlefield and the position that Kiev is in, we've seen in recent months that because they're obviously not advancing on the front lines, they're not gaining any significant territory, they've turned to kind of what else can we do? They launched an incursion into Kursk, they launch long range strikes into Russian territory, they have a variety of drone strikes, drone attacks, different ways that they can target Russia that doesn't involve what's happening on the front lines. So, how do you view the situation that Kiev is in now, and really how much longer they can continue on with this war of attrition before they look at the NATO alliance and they go, okay, guys, we need you to start sending reinforcements in? And we're not talking about weapons, we're talking about manpower.
Again, a good question, and I think we can see all of the signs there all throughout the Biden administration. And again, this will continue onward. NATO preparing for some sort of incursion into Ukraine, the creation of some sort of buffer zone, exactly like what they did in Syria to try to freeze the conflict, to deter any further Russian advances. So what they're doing right now, I mean, this is just something we can guess at. We don't know for certain, but it would appear that all of these stunts that Ukraine is performing, this is to keep the general public in support of the war and to keep Ukrainians fighting onward. They want to convince Ukrainians to fight on for as long as possible, even though it's obviously hopeless. There's no way they're going to be able to turn the tide at this point, or at any point, actually. When we look at it objectively, many people have said that from the very beginning, that this was a conflict Ukraine could never win. But again, we have to remember it was never meant to be one. So what we're looking at is, it is a war of attrition in Ukraine, but it is also a geopolitical struggle of attrition in many ways. Which side is going to overstretch itself first, and who's going to be able to manage all of these pressure points, and who is going to crack first? And so going back to Syria, that was a very concerning sign, because that is a sign of Russia and Iran cracking. But then again, looking at the state of the collective West military industrial capacity and what they're attempting to do vis-a-vis Russia and also China, I mean, there are cracks all around. So it really is just only time can tell, really, who is going to prevail, who manages all of this better over time.
Yeah, and it is interesting too, looking at the situation in Syria, as you were saying there. I mean, the US has acted like, all right, we finally overthrew Bashar al Assad. Now we have this, democracy loving, formerly ISIS. Now he's not a dictator anymore. Now he's a great leader. He looks like he's Zelensky, or the Arab version of Zelensky, coming into office, right? They're like, we've solved everything in Syria. But as you were noting earlier, I mean, the US has spent years fueling unrest in Syria and doing it intentionally, right? Their goal was to overthrow the government. So now you have all of these different factions in Syria who already were starting to get reports that they're saying, okay, we are not happy here. We're not happy with the current situation. When it comes to what unrest we could see and how that could kind of spill over, is there anything in particular that you're keeping an eye on there when it comes to Syria? And then I guess the question then becomes, how much are the US, Turkey, Russia going to get involved in that? And does that kind of depend on where things are when it comes to their own conflicts at home?
But I think the situation in Syria is going to be very similar to the situation in Libya. There wasn't some sort of collapse or mindless infighting. There was a very concerted effort to take all of those extremists, all of those weapons, and leverage them across the rest of the region to turn Libya into a hub of terrorism that the U.S. could export back to the Middle East. They were literally taking these terrorists and sending them to Syria to fight. And they were also sending them all across northern Africa. And a lot of that terrorism, deliberately created and fueled by the US, was used to justify the continued presence of US and French bases across the region. Now we see how that is turning out. It's not turning out well for the collective West, but initially that is what they did. And that is what they will do with Syria. They have all of these highly trained, organized terrorists, mountains of weapons. They're going to use them. So they're going to keep them busy so that they don't start doing things that are unpredictable or counterproductive for the US. And there's a lot of targets for them to array themselves against. Lebanon, Iraq, there's Iranian-friendly organizations, militias, and political factions in Iraq that the US would like to liquidate or put in check. So they will use these militants to do that. So I think that's what we should look out for, the way the US is going to leverage these groups next across the rest of the region and ultimately against Iran.
Yeah, I think it all comes back to Iran and all of the different ways that it can be targeted. Now, while I have you here, I do want to ask you about the situation involving China. And I know that you published a video last month, which I'll link below, titled Syria Today, Iran Tomorrow, and Inevitably China. And it's no secret the Pentagon has been warning about Beijing as a major quote unquote threat, really competition, for years now. But when it comes to the incoming Trump administration, I mean, we've heard it from officials like the next Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who I still cannot believe is our next Secretary of State, but he's warning that the US could see war with China before 2030. Now, to me, it feels insane, right? To think that you would have the US literally go to war with China. I'm going, that sounds so stupid. If they haven't learned from Russia, they should have, but they really stand to learn with China. How do you view that threat and kind of what's in it for these power hungry neocons in Washington, that it's like they can't just take defeat from Russia? Now they have to go on to the bigger thing.
Well, ultimately, this is all about China. They see, and this is just the truth, whether people want to hear it or not. They don't want to see a non-white, non-Western nation rise and surpass the collective West. To them, this is unacceptable. This is a result of generations of the Western mindset, imperial mindset, having dominated the planet for so long, so many centuries. And this is unacceptable to them, and they will stop at nothing to prevent this from happening. And we can see what they're willing to do to try to prevent this from happening. The conflict with Russia ultimately is about ultimately isolating China. Iran also factors into that. If you look at US strategic plans concerning China, and again, this is something that spans administrations, it really has nothing to do with any specific administration, they're not really actually planning for a direct war with China itself in China. They're preparing a maritime blockade. They want to cripple the economy and collapse China that way. And they have taken many steps toward this. And again, just as we were saying between Biden and Trump regarding Iran and also Russia, the Biden administration spent its entire 4 years preparing the U.S. military for precisely this. If you really think about it, the Biden administration reconfigured the entire U.S. Marine Corps specifically to interdict Chinese shipping. It is now a missile force. They gave up all of their tanks. They switched them out for anti-ship missiles. And now they're a highly mobile force that can go anywhere in Asia Pacific and beyond to set up choke points for Chinese shipping. Now they claim it's for military vessels, but it's obviously also something they could use to interdict maritime shipping, cargo, freight, hydrocarbons going to China. And we see the buildup in the South China Sea. They say to protect freedom of navigation. Everything navigating through the South China Sea is essentially trade going to and from China. And now we see the Trump administration, even before coming into office, talking about the Panama Canal, and of course, destabilizing the Middle East, the source of hydrocarbons for China. This is all on the grand board. This is all about isolating and crippling and strangling the Chinese economy. And of course, Russia fits into this because it shares a long land border with China, and they can just send natural resources, including hydrocarbons, directly into China. This is something the US cannot interdict. So they'll just topple the Russian government and put Russia in disarray. That is the plan. This is what they're trying to do. And if you understand that, you can see how it has continued from one administration to the other, despite all of the political rhetoric. So this is why I always beg people to please cut through the political rhetoric, see the continuity of agenda, because this is what they're doing. And the only chance we have at stopping it is raising awareness and getting people pulled out of these strategies of tension that their emotions have drawn them into. And you can't blame people for that, but so that they can see the big picture and oppose it, and at least not participate in it, if nothing else.
Very well said. And I know it can be hard sometimes, especially for people who identify on whatever side of the political aisle they may be on, but they look and they go, well, I don't want war with Russia, but China's the bad guy. And being able to be in a place where you can call it out accordingly, right? Call out the fact that, hey, the US establishment is one team at the end of the day, and they very clearly have at least a major goal and then a lot of minor goals along the way. I think that there's certainly a lot to be learned and a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down and to give your insight on all of the latest. Brian Berletic, a geopolitical analyst and host of the New Atlas, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment. And as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also find Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.